The interrogation chamber aboard the hegemony cruiser Dominion's Edge was designed to intimidate. Crystalline walls curved upward into darkness, their surfaces rippling with bioluminescent patterns that pulsed in rhythm with the ship's heartbeat. The air tasted of ozone and something metallic that made human sinuses burn. Lieutenant Commander Natasha Volkov sat perfectly still in the center of it all, her hands cuffed behind the chair with restraints that hummed with contained energy. Across from her, 3 figures loomed in the artificial twilight. The Kethmori Inquisitor's carapace gleamed like polished obsidian, its 4 arms moving in deliberate, hypnotic gestures as it spoke. The creature's voice emerged from somewhere deep in its thorax, a sound like grinding stone wrapped in silk. Human designation, Volkov, Natasha. Service record indicates 15 standard rotations in the Terran Defense Corps, multiple commendations for unconventional tactics. The word dripped with disdain. You stand accused of violating 17 articles of the Galactic Warfare Convention during the siege of Kepler Station. To the Inquisitor's left, a Voxhani observer shifted its translucent bulk, membranes fluttering with what passed for amusement among its kind. The gas giant natives found physical violence both fascinating and primitive, like watching children play with sharp sticks. Its voice came through a translation matrix, eerily musical. The human killed 43 hegemony soldiers with archaic weapons, while the station's defense grid was offline. Fascinating behavioral deviation from expected parameters. The third figure remained silent. General Thex of the Morden Confederacy stood like a pillar of scarred bronze, his 6 eyes reflecting the chamber's light in different spectrums. His people were warriors, but they fought with honor codes older than human civilization. What Volkov had done on Kepler Station challenged every principle they held sacred. The evidence is overwhelming, the Inquisitor continued, its mandibles clicking rhythmically. Security footage shows you moving through 17 decks of the station, eliminating trained soldiers with nothing but primitive bladed weapons and improvised traps. You turned a routine boarding action into a massacre. Volkov's expression hadn't changed since they'd brought her in 6 hours ago. Her face bore the map of someone who had seen too much and survived anyway. A thin scar across her left cheek, eyes the color of winter ice, and the kind of stillness that comes from knowing exactly how dangerous you are. Her uniform was torn and stained, but she wore it like armor. Kepler Station housed 3,000 civilians, she said finally, her voice carrying the faint accent of the outer colonies. Families, children. Your routine boarding action had a 97% casualty projection for non-combatants. The Kethmori's head tilted, compound eyes catching the light. Acceptable losses for a strategic objective. The station controlled shipping lanes worth, I don't care what it was worth. Volkov's interruption cut through the chamber like a blade. You want to know about my methods? My unconventional tactics? I'll tell you about them. She leaned forward as much as the restraints allowed, and for the first time, something dangerous flickered in those winter eyes. But first, you might want to run a deeper scan on the weapons you confiscated from me. The Voxhani's membranes rippled with curiosity. It gestured to a nearby console where Volkov's gear had been laid out like evidence in a courtroom. Her sidearm, ammunition, tactical vest, and there at the center, a combat knife that had seen better decades. The blade was scarred and pitted, with chips along the edge that spoke of hard use and desperate moments. General Thex moved for the first time, his massive frame creating new shadows as he approached the display. His 6 eyes focused on the knife, scanning it with the intensity of someone who understood weapons as extensions of the soul. This blade, his voice rumbled like distant thunder. It carries traces of 17 different alloy compositions. Kethmori battleplate, hegemony officer's insignia, traces of exotic matter from Void Strider armor. The Inquisitor's mandibles stopped clicking. 17 different. Every mark tells a story, Volkov said quietly. Every chip, every scratch, every dent in that blade represents someone who thought they knew what humans were capable of, someone who underestimated us because we don't have natural armor or forearms or the ability to phase through solid matter. She looked directly at each of her captors in turn, and suddenly the interrogation chamber felt smaller, more intimate. You asked me here to explain my actions on Kepler Station. But what you really want to know is how a single human with primitive weapons held off your elite forces for 6 hours and turned a guaranteed victory into a tactical disaster. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the ship's heartbeat and the soft hum of the restraints. Outside the chamber's walls, the hegemony fleet held position around the captured human vessel, but inside this crystalline cocoon, 3 of the galaxy's most powerful species found themselves leaning forward to hear what one small, scarred human had to say. The first mark, Volkov began, her eyes growing distant, came from a Kethmori champion on Proxima 7, 10 feet tall, natural armor that could deflect plasma rounds, and the arrogance that comes from never meeting an equal opponent. The memory carried her back 18 months, to a world where red dust devils danced across endless plains, and the settlement of New Bakersfield had been carved from rock and stubbornness. She'd been a staff sergeant then, part of a joint peacekeeping force trying to mediate a dispute between human colonists and a Kethmori hive clan over mining rights. The negotiations had been going nowhere for weeks, she continued, her voice taking on the cadence of someone reliving events rather than simply recounting them. Your people claimed ancestral rights to the lithium deposits based on some ancient spawning ground mythology. Our colonists had legal terraforming permits and 3 generations of sweat equity in the soil. The Inquisitor's compound eyes reflected fragments of the chamber's light as it processed this information. The Proxima 7 incident was classified as a mutual withdrawal with no hostile action recorded. Volkov's smile held no warmth. That's because your champion never reported what actually happened. Hard to file an official complaint when you've been publicly humiliated by a primitive biped in front of your entire hive clan. She shifted slightly in her restraints, and the energy cuffs responded with a warning pulse. Hive Marshal Zekthara was his name. You probably knew him. Most Kethmori elite formations do. He stood 3 meters tall in his ceremonial combat armor, had mandibles that could crush steel, and a reputation for never backing down from a challenge. Zekthara was formidable, the Inquisitor admitted, its voice carrying undertones that the translation matrix couldn't quite capture. His loss was mourned throughout the battlecasts. His loss was preventable, Volkov countered, but he made the same mistake you all seem to make when dealing with humans. He assumed that because we evolved from prey animals on a garden world, we'd fold under pressure. The chamber's bioluminescence pulsed brighter, responding to the emotional undertones in the conversation. General Thex remained motionless near the evidence display, but his 6 eyes had focused entirely on the scarred knife, as if reading its history in the pattern of nicks and scratches. The standoff came to a head when some of the younger colonists started making noise about armed resistance, Volkov continued. Zekthara saw it as an opportunity to demonstrate Kethmori superiority. He issued a formal challenge. Single combat, traditional rules, winner takes the disputed territory. The Voxhani's membranes fluttered with what might have been amusement. Standard dominance display behavior. Your species accepts such challenges at an 87% rate when territorial resources are at stake. I accepted, Volkov said simply. Not because I wanted to, but because I knew what would happen if I didn't. Zekthara would interpret refusal as species-wide cowardice, and suddenly every human settlement in this sector would have Kethmori raiders testing their defenses. She closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them, they seemed to look through her captors rather than at them. The combat circle was traditional, 50 meters diameter, natural weapons only, fight to yield or incapacitation. Zekthara entered wearing full battle regalia, carrying weapons forged from the same meteorite iron that made his ancestors' first tools. "And you carried a standard-issue combat knife," the Inquisitor observed, glancing at the display where the weapon rested under examination lights. "I carried what I'd always carried," she corrected. "This knife came with me when I enlisted, went with me through basic training, through my first deployment to the Titan Belt, through every boarding action and ground assault that followed. By the time I faced Zekthara, it had already saved my life more times than I could count." The energy restraints hummed as she leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to something almost conversational. "The thing about Keth Mori combat doctrine is that it's built around overwhelming physical superiority. They're stronger, faster, better armored than most species they encounter. Their fighting style reflects that, brutal, direct, meant to end conflicts quickly through demonstration of superior force." General Thex's voice rumbled through the chamber like distant artillery. "Efficient tactics for a dominant species. Efficient, yes. Adaptable, no." Volkov's smile was sharp enough to cut. Zekthara entered that circle expecting to face either a terrified human who would break at the first exchange, or a reckless one who would charge straight into his weapons and die gloriously, but uselessly. She paused, letting the silence stretch until even the ship's heartbeat seemed louder. Instead, he got something no Keth Mori warrior caste manual had prepared him for. He got someone who had learned to fight dirty, to survive when survival should have been impossible, and to turn disadvantages into weapons. The first exchange had lasted exactly 3.5 seconds. Zekthara's opening move was textbook Keth Mori aggression, a thunderous charge meant to close distance and end the fight with overwhelming force. His warblade, a curved length of meteoric iron that sang as it cut through Proxima 7's thin atmosphere, descended in an arc that would have bisected any opponent foolish enough to meet it head-on. Volkov had stepped sideways and rolled, coming up behind the champion's left flank with her knife already moving. The blade found the 1-centimeter gap between Zekthara's thorax armor and his left arm guard, sliding through the joint's protective membrane to draw first blood. The crowd went silent, she continued, her voice carrying the weight of that remembered moment. Not just quiet, silent in the way that happens when something impossible occurs right in front of you. Zekthara looked down at the green fluid leaking from his armor joint, then at me, and I saw something in his compound eyes that I don't think he'd ever experienced before. "Fear," General Thex said quietly, his 6 eyes still focused on the knife. He experienced fear for the first time. "Not fear of death," Volkov clarified. "Keth Mori don't fear dying. That's bred out of your warrior castes from the moment they hatch." He was afraid of losing to something he'd been taught was beneath his notice, of failing his entire species against a creature that shouldn't have been able to touch him. The Voxhani's membranes rippled in complex patterns as it processed this information. Psychological warfare, fascinating adaptation for a physically inferior species. "It wasn't psychological warfare," Volkov said sharply. "It was survival. When you're outmatched in every measurable category, you learn to fight with everything you have, including your opponent's expectations." She closed her eyes, and for a moment, the only sounds in the chamber were the ship's mechanical breathing and the soft hum of containment fields. When she spoke again, her voice carried the cadence of someone who had told this story to herself many times, usually in the dark hours before dawn when sleep wouldn't come. Zekthara's second attack was more cautious. He'd learned that I wouldn't behave like his training simulations predicted, so he fell back on pure technique. His blade work was magnificent, centuries of martial tradition distilled into movements so perfect they looked choreographed. The memory unfolded in her mind like a tactical recording. The Keth Mori champion had become a whirlwind of controlled violence, his war blade tracing patterns through the air that would have carved apart any conventional opponent. But Volkov hadn't fought conventionally since her first week of combat deployment. "I gave ground," she continued, but not randomly. Every step backward was calculated. Every dodge was designed to position me for the next exchange. Zekthara was fighting to demonstrate superiority. I was fighting to survive, and survival doesn't care about looking impressive. The Inquisitor's mandibles clicked in what might have been disapproval. Humans excel at undignified combat. We excel at winning when we shouldn't, Volkov corrected. There's a difference. Dignity is a luxury for species that can afford to fight fair. The third exchange had been the turning point. Zekthara, growing frustrated with his inability to pin down his smaller, more agile opponent, had committed to a devastating overhead strike that would have split stone. It was the kind of attack that ended fights, provided it connected. Volkov had stepped inside his guard instead of away, accepting a grazing blow across her ribs in exchange for getting close enough to strike at the champion's center mass. Her knife, guided by instinct and desperation in equal measure, had found the intersection of 3 armor plates and slid home with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "The blade went in clean," she said, her fingers unconsciously tracing the movement even though her hands were restrained. 6 inches of steel between his primary and secondary hearts. Not enough to kill him immediately, but enough to let him know that I could have, if I'd wanted to. The silence that followed was different from the previous pauses. This wasn't the comfortable quiet of a story being told, but the heavy stillness that comes when predators recognize each other. "You spared him," General Thex observed, and there was something like respect in his rumbling voice. "I gave him a choice," Volkov replied. "The same choice I give everyone who underestimates what humans are capable of. He could yield, acknowledge that his assumptions about human capabilities were flawed, and walk away with nothing worse than wounded pride and a reminder scar. Or he could continue fighting and learn exactly how many vital points a human can identify on a Keth Mori body when her life depends on it. The Keth Mori Inquisitor's compound eyes reflected the chamber's bioluminescence in complex patterns, and he chose to yield. He chose to survive, Volkov said, but more than that, he chose to think. That's the thing about real combat. It strips away all the assumptions and political posturing and leaves you with hard truths. The hard truth was that a human sergeant with a scratched-up knife had just put him on the ground in front of his entire hive clan. She shifted in her restraints, and the energy field responded with a warning pulse that made the air taste of copper and ozone. After the match, Zekthara asked me about the knife. He wanted to know what kind of exotic alloys it was made from, what enhancement technologies had been built into it. When I told him it was standard issue steel with no modifications beyond regular maintenance, he didn't believe me. "So you showed him," the Voxhani said, its musical voice carrying undertones of fascination. "You demonstrated that the weapon's power came not from its construction, but from the hand that wielded it." "I showed him the first dent," Volkov confirmed. "The one along the back edge, about 2 centimeters from the guard. That came from a boarding action in the Vega system, when I had to use the knife as a pry bar to open a sealed compartment where 30 civilians were trapped in a decompressing hull section. The memory of that day still carried the taste of recycled air and fear sweat. The merchant vessel Prosperity's Dream had been gutted by pirates, its crew dead or fled, but sensors had detected life signs in what should have been empty space. Volkov and her squad had found them in a storage compartment that had been jury-rigged into a makeshift life pod, the seals holding by willpower and prayer. The compartment door had been warped by explosive decompression, she continued. Standard equipment couldn't get enough purchase to force it open, and cutting through would have taken too long. So I jammed my knife into the seal gap and used it as leverage, knowing that the blade might snap under the pressure. The Inquisitor leaned forward slightly, its 4 arms adjusting position with fluid precision. "You risked your primary weapon to save non-combatants?" "I risked a piece of steel to save 30 people, Volkov replied. "The knife held, the door opened, and we got them to safety. But that first dent remained, and every time I drew the blade after that, I remembered why it was there. She looked at each of her captors in turn, her ice-blue eyes reflecting the chamber's shifting light. That's what Zekthara didn't understand at first. He kept asking about the knife's specifications, its combat rating, its material composition. What he couldn't grasp was that the weapon's history mattered more than its metallurgy. General Thex moved away from the evidence display, his massive frame creating new shadows as he approached her chair. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who understood warriors and the tools they carried. Each mark tells a story, he said, echoing her earlier words. Each dent represents a choice made under pressure, a moment when survival depended on the weapon performing beyond its design parameters. Exactly, Volkov said, and for the first time since the interrogation began, something like approval flickered in her expression. By the time I faced Zekthara, that knife had been with me through 47 combat deployments, 6 ship-to-ship actions, and more ground engagements than I cared to count. It had cut through bulkhead steel, deflected energy bolts, and opened more sealed doors than a maintenance tool. She paused, her gaze growing distant. But most importantly, it had never failed me when failure meant death. That kind of reliability can't be manufactured or programmed. It has to be earned, one emergency at a time. The interrogation chamber's bioluminescence had dimmed during her recounting, as if the ship itself was leaning in to listen. The Voxhani observer's membranes moved in slow, hypnotic patterns that suggested deep thought, while the Keth Mori Inquisitor's mandibles had stilled completely. Only General Thex seemed comfortable with the silence, his 6 eyes continuing their examination of the scarred blade on the evidence table. Zekthara left Proxima 7 3 days after our match, Volkov continued, but before he departed, he made a point of speaking with every human in the settlement. He wanted to understand what made us different from the baseline projections in his species' cultural database. The memory brought with it the smell of red dust and the sound of fusion generators humming in the distance. The Keth Mori champion had moved through New Bakersfield like a scholar conducting field research, his earlier arrogance replaced by something approaching academic curiosity. He interviewed farmers, engineers, children barely old enough to walk. He wanted to know about Earth, about human history, about the wars we'd fought among ourselves before we reached the stars. Volkov's smile was sharp enough to cut. What he learned disturbed him more than losing our combat had. The Inquisitor's compound eyes caught the light as it shifted position. What aspect of human development patterns did he find troubling? The fact that we'd managed to nearly destroy ourselves 6 different ways before we developed interstellar travel, Volkov replied. Nuclear weapons, biological warfare, environmental collapse, artificial intelligence run amok, nanoscale catastrophes, and good old-fashioned conventional warfare that killed hundreds of millions over ideological differences. She leaned back in her chair as much as the restraints allowed, her voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a lecture to students who weren't quite keeping up. Most species develop faster than light travel before they develop weapons capable of rendering their homeworld uninhabitable. It's a natural progression. You reach for the stars because exploration is safer than the alternatives. The Voxhani's musical voice rippled through the chamber's atmosphere. Standard evolutionary pathway for spacefaring civilizations. Outward expansion as pressure release for territorial competition. Humans did it backward, Volkov said. We developed the ability to kill ourselves on a planetary scale first, then had to learn how to live with that knowledge. Every human child grows up knowing that our species came within hours of total extinction at least 3 times during the 20th and 21st centuries. General Thex's rumbling voice cut through the chamber's artificial twilight. This knowledge shapes your combat psychology. It shapes everything about us, Volkov confirmed. When you grow up knowing that your species survived by the narrowest possible margins, you develop certain characteristics. You learn to fight when fighting seems hopeless. You learn to find solutions when no solutions exist. And you learn that sometimes the only difference between extinction and survival is one person refusing to give up. The knife on the evidence table seemed to gleam more brightly under the examination lights, as if responding to the conversation around it. Each scratch and dent caught the illumination differently, creating a map of violence and determination that spoke louder than words. Zekthara understood this. Eventually, she continued, he realized that human military doctrine wasn't based on overwhelming force or technological superiority, but on the assumption that every engagement might be the last one our species ever fought. That kind of existential pressure creates a very particular type of warrior. The memory shifted, carrying her forward through the months that followed. Reports had filtered back through intelligence channels that Zekthara had requested reassignment to the Kethmori Strategic Analysis Division, trading his combat command for a research position studying human military capabilities. His final report, classified at the highest levels but somehow leaked to human intelligence, had become required reading for anyone dealing with interspecies conflict. His conclusions were illuminating, Volkov said. He wrote that humans should be classified as a high-threat species, not because of our technology or physical capabilities, but because of our psychological adaptations to extreme survival pressure. The Inquisitor's mandibles resumed their rhythmic clicking, a sound like distant machinery. The report recommended caution when engaging human forces. The report recommended avoiding engagement entirely, unless absolutely necessary for core territorial defense, Volkov corrected. Zekthara had run the projections based on historical human military performance. He concluded that any conflict with our species would escalate beyond predicted parameters, because humans don't fight to win. We fight to survive, and survival doesn't recognize limits. She closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them, they seemed to focus on something beyond the chamber walls. That was the first mark on my knife. The first time someone from another species looked at humans and realized that their assumptions were not just wrong, but dangerously wrong. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the ship's mechanical breathing and the soft hum of energy fields. Outside the chamber, Volkov knew, the hegemony fleet held position around her captured vessel. But inside this crystalline cocoon, 3 of the galaxy's most dangerous species were beginning to understand that their prisoner might be more threat than victim. The second mark, she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of accumulated violence, came from a hegemony boarding action in the Centauri system. Your forces had trapped a refugee convoy carrying human civilians fleeing the failed colony on Kepler Prime. The memory brought with it the taste of recycled air and desperation. The convoy had been 3 converted cargo haulers and a medical ship, carrying 15,000 people who had lost everything when Kepler Prime's terraforming systems failed. They'd been 3 days out from the nearest human settlement when hegemony interdictors had dropped them back into normal space. Your commander claimed salvage rights, Volkov continued, her voice hardening. 15,000 refugees suddenly became unclaimed biological resources under some obscure provision in the Galactic Commerce Code. The Kethmori Inquisitor's compound eyes reflected fragments of light as it processed this information. Standard procedure for unclaimed vessels in disputed space. Standard procedure that assumed the refugees wouldn't fight back, Volkov replied, that they'd accept processing and relocation to whatever labor settlements needed workers, regardless of their own plans or preferences. She shifted in her restraints, and the energy cuffs responded with another warning pulse. What your commander didn't know was that I'd been aboard the lead transport as a military advisor, helping coordinate the evacuation from Kepler Prime. When his boarding parties came through the airlocks, they were expecting to process frightened civilians. The first hegemony trooper through the transport's main airlock had been a Sithkari warrior drone, its biomechanical enhancements gleaming under the ship's emergency lighting. The creature moved with the fluid precision of something that had been purpose-built for violence, its multiple weapon systems tracking potential threats with mechanical efficiency. It had died with Volkov's knife buried in the processing cluster that served as its brainstem, the blade sliding through the narrow gap between bio-armor plates with surgical precision. The boarding action was supposed to last 15 minutes, she said, her voice growing distant with memory. Standard doctrine called for overwhelming force applied quickly, with minimal damage to valuable cargo. Your troops were equipped for suppression, not sustained combat. She looked directly at the Inquisitor, her ice-blue eyes reflecting the chamber's shifting light. But they weren't facing standard resistance. They were facing refugees who had already lost everything once and weren't about to lose their freedom as well. The second mark on her knife had come from that Sithkari's bio-armor, a microscopic chip that had appeared when the blade struck something harder than bone, but softer than steel. Volkov remembered the moment with perfect clarity, the way the warrior drone's optical sensors had flared with surprise in the instant before its neural cluster shut down, the sound its body made hitting the deck plates, and the sudden silence that followed. 15 minutes became 6 hours, she continued, her voice carrying the weight of remembered exhaustion. What started as a routine boarding action turned into a running battle through 3 ships, with civilians trapped in the crossfire and your forces learning that humans fight differently when their backs are against the wall. The Voxhani's membranes rippled in complex patterns that suggested deep analysis, typical human behavior when protecting offspring and territorial resources. Documented aggression escalation of approximately 400% above baseline projections. We weren't protecting territory, Volkov said quietly. We were protecting hope. The distinction mattered more than her captors could understand. Territory could be reclaimed, resources could be replaced, but hope was something more fragile and more valuable than any physical asset. The refugees aboard those ships had carried with them the possibility of new lives, new chances, new beginnings on worlds where the mistakes of the past might not follow them. The hegemony boarding parties were equipped for suppression of civilian populations, she continued, but they were facing something their tactical databases hadn't accounted for. They were facing people who had already lost their homes, their possessions, everything they'd built over decades of hard work. The only thing left to lose was each other. General Thex moved closer to the evidence display, his 6 eyes focusing on the knife with the intensity of someone reading a text written in blood and metal. When survival becomes the only option, conventional rules no longer apply. Exactly, Volkov said, and there was approval in her voice. Your commander learned that lesson the hard way. By the time his forces secured the ships, he'd lost 37% of his boarding party, and the unclaimed biological resources he'd planned to process had cost him more than their potential labor value was worth. The memory carried her through corridors filled with emergency lighting and the acrid smell of discharged weapons. She'd moved from ship to ship through maintenance tunnels and cargo holds, coordinating civilian evacuation, while engaging hegemony forces in a series of running battles that had stretched her tactical knowledge to its limits. The third ship was where it got interesting, she said, her smile sharp enough to cut diamond. Your boarding party had cornered a group of families in the main cargo hold, about 200 people, including 60 children under the age of 10. The Inquisitor's mandibles clicked in what might have been concern. Civilian casualties in such scenarios typically reach 70 to 80%. Would have, if they'd been facing anyone else, Volkov agreed. But they weren't just facing me. They were facing the collective rage of 15,000 people who had decided that death was preferable to slavery. She closed her eyes, and for a moment, the interrogation chamber faded around her. In its place, she saw the cargo hold of the transport New Horizon, its vast space filled with makeshift shelters and the quiet desperation of people who had run out of places to run. The hegemony squad leader was a professional, she continued. Vektari Special Forces, if I remember correctly. His tactical assessment was perfect: control the civilians, use them as leverage against any remaining resistance, and process the entire convoy with minimal further losses. The Vektari warrior had been everything the Sithkari drone was not: thoughtful, adaptable, and experienced enough to recognize when a situation was developing beyond standard parameters. He'd entered the cargo hold with weapons lowered, speaking in accented but clear standard galactic, offering terms that might have seemed reasonable under other circumstances. He promised safe processing, adequate nutrition during transport, and assignment to colonies where human labor was valued and well treated, Volkov said. From his perspective, it was a generous offer. Death or slavery weren't the only options. There was also survival with dignity. She opened her eyes and looked directly at each of her captors in turn. What he didn't understand was that dignity isn't something that can be granted by others. It's something you either have or you don't, and once you've lost it, no amount of adequate nutrition can buy it back. The confrontation had lasted less than 30 seconds. The Vektari squad leader had been explaining the terms of surrender when Volkov emerged from behind a stack of supply containers, her knife already in motion. The blade had found the gap between his helmet and chest armor with the precision of a surgeon, opening his throat in a single fluid movement that left no time for counterattack. "That was the second mark," she said quietly. A tiny chip along the blade's edge where it caught on his armor's neck seal. Vektari battle gear is some of the best in the galaxy, composite materials that can stop energy weapons and deflect projectiles. But there's always a weakness, always a point where protection ends and flesh begins. The silence that followed was different from the previous pauses. This wasn't the comfortable quiet of a story being told, but the heavy stillness that comes when predators acknowledge the presence of an apex hunter. His squad surrendered, General Thex observed, and there was something like understanding in his rumbling voice. His squad ran, Volkov corrected. There's a difference. Surrender implies negotiation, terms, some kind of structured resolution. What happened in that cargo hold was simpler and older than any military doctrine. She leaned forward in her restraints, ignoring the energy field's warning pulse. They saw their leader die in a way that their training hadn't prepared them for. Not in glorious combat, not as part of some tactical exchange, but executed with the kind of efficiency that comes from absolute commitment to a single outcome. The refugees had watched in silence as the remaining hegemony troops retreated, their weapons still charged, but their will to use them broken by the demonstration they'd just witnessed. In that moment, the careful calculations of military action had given way to something more primitive and more powerful, the understanding that some fights could only end one way. The convoy reached human space 4 days later, Volkov continued. 15,000 refugees found new homes, new chances, new lives, but the price was paid in blood, and that blood left its mark on the tool that spilled it. She looked at the knife on the evidence display, its scarred surface catching the examination lights. Every mark tells a story. Every chip remembers a moment when someone learned that humans don't fight the way other species expect us to. The Kethmori Inquisitor's compound eyes reflected the chamber's bioluminescence as it processed what it had heard. "You speak of these killings as necessary actions, but your methods violated numerous interstellar conventions regarding combat engagement. My methods violated conventions written by species that have never faced extinction," Volkov replied. "Every rule of engagement, every protocol for civilized warfare assumes that there are things more important than survival. Honor, dignity, proper procedure, strategic objectives, all luxuries for people who have alternatives." She smiled, and the expression was colder than the space between stars. When alternatives disappear, when survival becomes the only goal that matters, humans become something that no amount of tactical analysis can predict. We become desperate, and desperation makes us infinitely more dangerous than any weapon system ever could. The chamber's bioluminescence had dimmed to barely more than starlight, creating an atmosphere of intimate confession that made the three alien interrogators lean closer despite themselves. Volkov's voice had grown quieter as her story progressed, but the words carried more weight, as if each syllable was carved from some dense, dangerous metal. The marks kept accumulating, she continued, her ice-blue eyes reflecting what little light remained. Ship-to-ship actions in the Vega system, where pirates learned that human merchant crews don't surrender when their families are aboard. Ground engagements on contested worlds, where colonial militias discovered that humans will fight for land that isn't strategically valuable simply because it's theirs. She shifted in her restraints, the energy cuffs humming their familiar warning, but her captors no longer seemed concerned about her mobility. The real danger, they were beginning to understand, wasn't what she might do to them physically. It was what she represented, the leading edge of a species that had learned to survive by breaking every rule that civilized warfare held sacred. By the time Kepler Station happened, she said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, this knife had seen 43 separate engagements. 43 times it had tasted blood, 43 times it had proven that human determination could overcome superior force, better technology, and overwhelming odds. The memory of Kepler Station rose around her like smoke from a funeral pyre. The orbital facility had been humanity's foothold in the contested Kepler system, a research station and waypoint that served 3,000 civilian personnel and their families. When the hegemony fleet had arrived to claim the system, the station's commander had been given 12 hours to evacuate. Your admiral was generous, she said, looking directly at the Kethmori Inquisitor. 12 hours to pack up 3 decades of research, to gather personal belongings, to say goodbye to the only home some of those families had ever known. Standard protocol called for immediate evacuation, but Admiral Cresinara allowed extra time as a gesture of, what did he call it? Interspecies courtesy. The Inquisitor's mandibles clicked with what might have been embarrassment. Admiral Cresinara was known for his adherence to proper procedure. Admiral Cresinara was known for his arrogance, Volkov corrected. He gave us 12 hours because he assumed that 12 hours would be more than enough for primitive humans to gather their belongings and flee in terror from superior hegemony forces. She closed her eyes, and the interrogation chamber faded around her, replaced by the sterile corridors and observation lounges of Kepler Station in its final hours. The facility had been a marvel of human engineering, its rotating sections generating artificial gravity, while its central hub remained in zero-G for specialized research. 3,000 souls had called it home, and most of them had been preparing to abandon everything they'd built when Volkov arrived with new orders. I reached the station 11 hours and 47 minutes after Cresinara's ultimatum, she continued. My transport docked just as the last civilian evacuation pods were launching. Officially, I was there to oversee the final security sweep and ensure that no classified materials fell into enemy hands. General Thex's 6 eyes remained focused on the knife, but his voice carried the weight of someone who understood military necessity. Unofficial orders. Unofficially, I was there to buy time, Volkov admitted. Fleet Command knew that Kepler Station's strategic position made it invaluable, but they also knew that any direct military response would escalate the conflict beyond manageable parameters. They needed a solution that would delay hegemony occupation without providing justification for a full-scale war. The Voxhani's membranes rippled with patterns that suggested complex analysis, a delaying action by a single operative, statistically improbable success parameters. Statistically impossible, Volkov agreed, which is probably why they sent me. When faced with impossible odds, human commanders have a tendency to deploy assets that specialize in making the impossible merely improbable. She opened her eyes, and the chamber's dim bioluminescence seemed brighter than before, as if her memories had brought their own illumination. The station was empty when Cresinara's boarding parties arrived. Corridors that should have been filled with terrified humans were silent, except for the hum of life support systems and the distant sound of docking clamps engaging. The Hegemony Admiral had been cautious, she remembered. His initial boarding force had been large enough to secure any reasonable resistance, but small enough to avoid unnecessary casualties if the humans decided to fight. Standard doctrine for occupying civilian installations called for overwhelming presence rather than overwhelming force, better to intimidate potential resistors than to create martyrs. The first squad made it exactly 17 meters past the main airlock, she said, her voice carrying the satisfaction of a craftsman describing a particularly elegant piece of work. They were Morden regulars, professional soldiers with good equipment and better training. They moved like they'd done this 100 times before, which they probably had. She looked at General Thex, noting the way his scarred bronze features had tightened at the mention of his species. No offense to your people's military capabilities, they were good soldiers following reasonable tactical doctrine, but they were expecting to secure an empty station, not hunt a human who had turned 3,000 corridors into a maze of death traps and kill zones. The first trap had been beautifully simple, a maintenance hatch rigged to explosive decompression, triggered by the weight of heavily armored soldiers moving in standard formation. The blast had killed 2 Morden troopers instantly and wounded 3 others badly enough to require evacuation. More importantly, it had announced that Kepler Station was no longer empty. Cresenara learned from that first encounter, she continued. His second boarding party was twice the size, better equipped, and led by officers who understood that they were facing active resistance rather than abandoned corridors. The cat-and-mouse game that followed had lasted 6 hours and 17 minutes. Volkov had moved through the station like a ghost, using maintenance shafts and emergency passages to stay ahead of systematic hegemony sweeps, while leaving behind a trail of improvised obstacles that turned routine advancement into a deadly puzzle. The thing about fighting alone in a known environment, she said, is that every advantage belongs to the defender. I knew which corridors had structural weaknesses, which systems could be overloaded to create distractions, which sections could be isolated and flooded with everything from sleeping gas to industrial coolants. But the hegemony forces had been learning too. Each trap they encountered taught them more about their opponent's capabilities and limitations. Each ambush site they cleared gave them better intelligence about the station's layout and the defenders' likely positions. By hour 4, they had me pinned in the central research section, she admitted. 3 squads converging from different directions, cutting off my escape routes one by one. Standard tactics would have called for surrender at that point. I was outnumbered, outgunned, and rapidly running out of places to run. The Kethmori Inquisitor leaned forward slightly, its compound eyes catching the chamber's dim light. But you did not surrender. I did something that their tactical databases hadn't prepared them for, Volkov said. I stopped running. The final confrontation had taken place in Research Lab 7, a zero-gravity chamber where human scientists had been studying exotic matter interactions before the evacuation order came through. The space was filled with delicate equipment and dangerous materials, a combination that made it unsuitable for conventional weapons fire. The squad leader was smart, she continued, Commander Vexthul of the Morden Assault Corps. He recognized the tactical problems that the environment presented and adapted his approach accordingly. Instead of storming the lab with weapons blazing, he ordered his troops to set up a perimeter and wait me out. General Thex's rumbling voice cut through the chamber's atmosphere like distant thunder. Sound tactical thinking, containment and negotiation rather than direct assault. It would have worked against any reasonable opponent, Volkov agreed. But I wasn't being reasonable. I was being human, and humans have a tendency to redefine the parameters of any engagement when conventional options run out. She had floated in the center of Research Lab 7, surrounded by equipment worth more than most planets' annual budgets, while hegemony forces took positions at every entrance. The exotic matter containment units hummed with barely controlled energies, their warning lights painting the zero-gravity space in shades of amber and crimson. Vexthal offered me terms, she said. Honorable surrender, prisoner of war status, eventual repatriation when diplomatic solutions could be reached. From his perspective, it was a generous offer to someone who had already inflicted significant casualties on his forces. The Morden commander had been everything she could have hoped for in an opponent: professional, intelligent, and just human enough in his thinking to make critical assumptions about what she would and wouldn't do in a desperate situation. I told him I'd consider his offer, she continued, but first, I wanted to show him something interesting about human space technology. The exotic matter containment units had been designed with multiple safety protocols, backup systems, and fail-safes that made accidental discharge virtually impossible, but they hadn't been designed to withstand deliberate sabotage by someone who understood their operational principles and had access to the maintenance controls. I disabled 6 containment units simultaneously, she said, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone describing a masterpiece, not enough to cause a catastrophic cascade failure that would destroy the entire station, but more than enough to flood the research section with exotic radiation that would kill anyone not protected by heavy shielding. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the ship's mechanical breathing seemed to pause as her captors processed the implications of what they'd just heard. You irradiated yourself, the Voxhani said finally, its musical voice carrying undertones of disbelief. You accepted lethal doses of exotic radiation to eliminate enemy forces. I accepted a probable death sentence to eliminate a certain defeat, Volkov corrected. There's a difference. Probable death meant there was still a chance, however small, that I might survive long enough to complete my mission. Certain defeat meant that 3,000 civilians would lose their homes and my species would lose a strategic foothold that had taken decades to establish. The exotic radiation had filled Research Lab 7 like invisible fire, triggering every alarm system in the section, while warning lights painted the zero-gravity space in shades of emergency crimson. The hegemony troops at the entrances had found themselves faced with a choice between advancing into lethal radiation or withdrawing and allowing their target to escape. Vexthal made the only reasonable decision, she said. He ordered his forces to fall back to minimum safe distance and wait for the radiation to dissipate. Standard doctrine for dealing with environmental hazards called for patience rather than heroism, but the radiation hadn't dissipated. Instead, it had spread through the station's ventilation systems, turning corridor after corridor into deadly zones that required full environmental protection to traverse. What had been a routine boarding action became a hazardous materials emergency that stretched hegemony resources beyond their operational limits. 6 hours after the containment breach, Admiral Cresinara ordered the evacuation of all hegemony forces from Kepler Station, she said. The facility was classified as unsuitable for immediate occupation due to exotic contamination, and the fleet withdrew to minimum safe distance. She looked at the knife on the evidence display, its scarred surface seeming to gleam more brightly in the chamber's dim light. That was where the final mark came from. Not from combat, not from killing, but from the radiation exposure that should have killed me within hours. The exotic particles had done something to the knife's molecular structure, creating microscopic fractures that caught light differently than the surrounding metal. It was the newest mark on the blade, and in many ways the most significant, a reminder that sometimes victory required sacrificing everything for a chance at survival. I was found 3 days later by a human rescue team, she continued, unconscious, severely irradiated, and technically dead according to most medical standards. But I was still breathing, still holding this knife, and still occupying a strategic position that had cost the enemy more than they were willing to pay. General Thex moved closer to her chair, his 6 eyes reflecting the chamber's bioluminescence as he studied her with the intensity of someone trying to solve a complex equation. The medical reports indicated full recovery within 6 months. Human physiology is more adaptable than most species realize, she said. We evolved on a planet that tried to kill us in creative ways for millions of years. Radiation, toxins, environmental extremes. We developed survival mechanisms that other species never needed. The interrogation chamber fell silent, except for the ship's mechanical breathing and the soft hum of energy fields. Outside these crystalline walls, Volkov knew the hegemony fleet held position around her captured vessel, waiting for orders that would determine whether this conversation ended in execution, imprisonment, or something else entirely. "So now you know," she said finally, looking at each of her captors in turn. "You asked about my methods, my unconventional tactics, my violations of interstellar warfare conventions. This knife has 43 marks on it, and each mark represents someone who learned too late that humans don't fight the way your tactical databases predict." She leaned back in her restraints, ignoring the energy cuff's warning pulse. "The real question isn't why I did what I did on Kepler Station. The real question is whether your species are prepared to deal with what humans become when we decide that survival is the only objective that matters." The Kethmori Inquisitor's mandibles had stilled completely, its compound eyes reflecting fragments of light as it processed everything it had heard. The Voxhani's membranes moved in slow, hypnotic patterns that suggested complex analysis, while General Thex continued his examination of the scarred blade with the intensity of someone reading prophecy in metal and blood. "Every mark tells a story," Volkov said quietly, echoing the words that had begun this interrogation. "Every chip, every scratch, every dent in that blade represents a moment when someone underestimated what humans are capable of when their backs are against the wall." She smiled, and the expression was sharp enough to cut diamond. "The question you need to ask yourselves is simple. How many more marks are you willing to add to that blade? Because I promise you, Lieutenant Commander Natasha Volkov is not the most dangerous human you'll ever encounter. I'm just the one you happen to catch." The silence that followed was different from all the others, not the pause between questions and answers, but the quiet that comes when predators recognize that the prey they've been hunting might be hunting them in return. In the crystalline depths of the interrogation chamber, 3 of the galaxy's most powerful species found themselves staring at a scarred piece of steel and wondering what other stories it might have to tell.